The work that I'm going to talk about really comes from long-term work as a researcher and as an academic, but then I had the opportunity to actually have to see if my words actually worked in practice, and I did have the honor of serving in the Obama administration, where in fact a lot of the work of the agency I led was focused on how do we deal with the kinds of changes that I'm going to describe, which have had particularly significant impact on low-wage workers, unskilled workers, some of the most vulnerable workers in the United States economy. And from discussions I've had for many years around the world, I know that similar kinds of challenges face workers globally, and I'll be very interested to hear how some of these trends play out in Iceland. I'm going to keep my remarks to about 20 minutes. And so some of the slides I'm going to share with you, I'll fly through rather quickly, but we can always come back and talk to them. Sonia mentioned that I have described what these changes really in the organization of business are as something I call the fissured workplace. And that term comes to me because my wife in her first occupation was a geologist. And I was one morning describing the changes that I had been studying to her as I was thinking about writing the book. And I was describing how the employment relationship in so many industries in the United States had broken apart, that where we once had this very simple idea of an employer and an employee, and that everything was built around that, laws, collective bargaining, really our whole way of thinking about how do you regulate, protect workers was built on that assumption. But in fact, for reasons I'll describe, employment has broken up and has gone in lots of directions. And as I was describing that, Miriam, my partner, said, well, it sounds like a rock that's fissured, that's broken apart. And as a geologically active country, Iceland, I'm sure you could sympathize with that kind of analogy, that rather than a simple rock, you have a rock that is splintered. And when a rock fissures, two things happen. First of all, fissures deepen. So once a rock starts to crack, that crack gets deeper and deeper. And in the same way, as I'll describe with one example, when an employment relationship fissures, as work, let's say, is subcontracted, very often what you see is the subcontractors start subcontracting that work, who then subcontract that work further, and the fissure deepens. The other things that happens with a fissure in a rock is it spreads. And it starts to destabilize the whole rock as it spreads. And similarly, in my research and the work of a lot of other people since I published the book, have documented how this fissuring, this breaking apart of the employment relationship, has spread both to other occupations within an industry and increasingly to new industries, as I'll describe. So the fissured workplace is really a description of what has happened in the United States, and again, I think in many countries over the last few decades. We often like to talk about the future of work. I make the argument we should be talking less about the future of work. We should be talking more about the present of work, because we haven't even adjusted, certainly in the United States, to the present of these kinds of changes and how they impact working people. And that's what I'd like to get to. So let me just take you through a few slides to discuss that. And I'll start, let me just start here. Can everyone see that, I hope? Okay. So what I just described has been certainly a major feature of our workplace and labor market for decades. but it has really been revealed by the COVID pandemic. In particular, the pandemic has really shown certain workers, the essential workers that have been on the front line of the pandemic, people in the healthcare industry, obviously, but also people, retail workers, the people who increasingly are delivering more and more of the goods and food to individual households. All of those workers have been particularly subjected to continuing to work, but have also been subject to health and safety risks, the ups and downs of employment as our economy has sputtered. We currently have somewhere around 30 million people receiving unemployment benefits in the United States, and many of those workers who are finding themselves in and out of employment are frontline essential workers who work sometimes and then find themselves out of employment other times. Those workers tend to have some of the lowest wages in the labor markets, and they are often workers who, for reasons I'll describe, often fall outside of the protections of our basic workplace laws. So these are workers that, because of their classification under our, what I would regard as broken workplace laws in many ways, don't receive worker compensation, for instance, if they're injured, do not receive the protections of our health and safety regulations more generally, aren't even necessarily covered by minimum wage and overtime. And so what COVID-19 and the recession have brought into even sharper focus is this whole group of workers who have long been unprotected, but now are even under more pressure as they face the front line of the pandemic. I could illustrate what I mean by the fissured workplace in many, many different kinds of industries and occupations. And perhaps in our discussion, we can talk about some of those different cases. I want to illustrate it with one of the models of home delivery that has become huge in the United States before the pandemic, but has really become incredibly dominant as a result of the pandemic. And that's the way that Amazon delivers products to millions of households in the United States through something it calls Amazon Flex. And Amazon Flex to me is just a perfect example and expression of what I mean by the fissured workplace. But as I say, we can talk about many other examples in any number of industries where you could tell similar stories. Now, the whole idea about Amazon Flex is Amazon obviously has always been central to its business model is efficiently delivering its products to individual households and delivering a huge range of products to those households. In business language, that would be called its core competency. Amazon has become the global giant it is because it has spent enormous amounts of capital and has been given enormous amount of capital by public capital markets and private markets as well to deliver on that, to say we will be the distributor that gets goods efficiently to people's homes. And that's an important part of the fissured workplace. One of the elements of a fissured workplace is that more and more companies are seeking to have that core competency. In fact, capital markets drive them to declaring that and saying, this is what we're good at, this is what we do for customers, this is what we do for investors. Now, another part of that story has been those same capital markets that demand this core competency also say, but don't do anything that's peripheral to that. If it's not about your core competency, find someone else to do that for you. And if we trace through what has happened in many businesses, what that has meant is companies really starting in after our, starting in the 1990s, accelerated by our last Great Recession in 2007, have shed work that weren't core to them. They have shifted it, they've outsourced it, they've subcontracted it, they've franchised it, or I'll show you in a moment, Amazon Flex has figured out a way to use platforms to move that work off of their balance sheet, if you will, and towards some other organization that's hired to do that work. And by doing that, something very profound has happened. It means that on one hand, the main company that has shifted that work still needs to maintain its core competency. And that means it needs to control the actions of the subcontractor or the franchisee. But at the same time, by shifting it to another organization, they're no longer their employees. And what that often means is they're no longer liable for, let's say, a collective bargaining agreement with those workers. They're no longer subject to the requirements of healthcare, payment into the healthcare system in the United States, which is employer-based. They no longer have to worry about compliance with workplace laws. And that shifting is an important part of the fissuring, that you can still control the outcome, but you no longer have to employ those workers. Now, the example of that in Amazon is the following. As the pandemic hit, Amazon's need to deliver more and more goods increased dramatically. Instead of actually employing the workforce directly who brings those goods to your door, Amazon came upon a model it calls Amazon Flex. And I'm not sure if it plays out similarly, or you have other retailers in Iceland that are doing a similar thing. But what Amazon does is creates a platform that adheres to Amazon standards and requirements about how you will deliver a package and the amount of time you are given to deliver that package to the consumer, and the quality standards, making sure the Amazon package is actually picked up by the consumer and not taken by somewhere else. And in particular, time-based standards. Amazon's business model is based on prompt delivery, more and more within a day or at most 2 days from the order. That's all still dictated by Amazon on this platform. But what Amazon has completely changed is who does that work. And rather than using this standard to deploy its own workforce, what Amazon has created is a battery of independent contractors who go to the platform and are paid by the delivery. They're not paid by the hour of work. They're not paid as Amazon employees, but they are paid, let's say, $60 to deliver a set of packages to a set of addresses they've been given. And they must deliver those packages however long it takes and whatever cost is borne by them if they are to receive the amount of money Amazon has agreed to pay them for that. That means not only is their time on their own, is based on their own performance, the amount they're paid, because they just get this flat rate for the payment, but the cost of fuel for driving your car, the depreciation on your car for using it, any accident you might encounter during the course of delivering those packages. If it requires you to go back to the customer because the customer isn't able to take the package, or you're delivering to an apartment building and you can't get inside to the mailroom, that's all on the individual driver to figure out. And at the end of the day, their compensation is the net difference from the cost they incurred, whatever is left over from them, if you will, divided by the number of hours it took them to do that. And what I show you at the bottom of the screen is that means that the payment to Amazon workers is very different than workers who are direct employees. If you look at, for instance, the United Parcel Service, which has a collective bargaining agreement with its direct workforce, a typical driver for the United Parcel Service, UPS, earns about $23 an hour and then gets benefits on top of that. Federal Express is a major package deliverer also in the United States that actually uses somewhat of an independent contracting relationship, but not nearly what I've described with Amazon. They make about $14 an hour. The Amazon Flex driver, the best analyses of what they actually take home after they've incurred expenses is $5. And so you can see the vast differences that this leads to in terms of how much people earn as a result of this example of fissuring. And in the discussion, I can talk about the Amazon model. The fissuring has gotten even deeper because what we are now seeing in the Amazon Flex model is certain people enter the Amazon Flex model and they grab a bunch of orders and then they subcontract them out to other people. And so again, you can imagine the deeper the fissure, the more subcontractors you have, the less there is left for that final worker. And this is really the essence of the problem of the fissured workplace, is that we have broken apart this relationship into so many pieces that it leaves the workers at the end of that line with less and less for them to take home in terms of their own pay, as well as very often a lack of protections because of their classification at the end of those chains of fissuring. Very typically, we're finding in more and more industries, those workers who are doing the work are no longer classified as employees for whoever they're working for, but they're classified as independent contractors, as if they're independent businesses, which means they're outside of the protections of our labor laws. Now, I see I've done what professors always do. I've gone on too long. Let me just jump ahead. I want to just end with just two insights about, well, what do we do? How might we think about the fissured workplace given those changes? And I want to start by saying these changes really have rippled across the entire economy. I estimate conservatively that about 30 to 35% of our workforce has been affected by different ways this fissured workplace plays out. That's a huge part of our workplace. That means it affects the way wages are set, the way that labor markets are operating. And so it's very hard. We can't just say, let's reverse this, let's make it go away. This is part of the way modern economies are organized. Now, that doesn't mean we have to sort of say, well, then we're stuck with it, there's nothing we can do. And I just want to articulate two ways I think we have, and then we potentially can deal with the fissured workplace. The first way is what we did when I was in the Obama administration, and that is think differently about how we enforce our laws. And let me just give you one diagram about that. This is just a diagram of what you can think of as sort of a typical fissured workplace with a major company at the top like Amazon, or a major hotel, a major manufacturer. And then below that, this fissuring, multiple parties that end up doing different parts of that work. Now, historically, when we do enforcement, we tend to look at the bottom of a chain like this. We tend to find the violations, the Amazon Flex driver in my last example, or a subcontractor. That's where you find the violations. And historically, that's where we focused our enforcement effort. What we tried to do in a number of different ways in the Obama administration is saying, this is just where the effect of the fissured workplace comes in. What we need to do is put our regulatory enforcement pressure at the top of the chain. We have to find ways to tell those lead companies, you can't have it both ways. you can't set all of the terms that ultimately lead to employment conditions to great detail, and yet at the end of the day saying it's not my problem. And we found a number of different ways we could bring in terms of union bargaining, make sure those people at the top of these chains are at the bargaining table, not just the smaller businesses at the bottom of the chain. And thinking differently about how one does enforcement of existing laws or how one does collective bargaining is what I'm trying to capture here. And that I think there are interesting ways that I can talk about where we have done that. The second thing, and this is a longer term issue, and I have a paper with a colleague of mine, Tanya Goldman, about this. I do think we have to revisit how we structure our workplace laws, certainly in the United States, and I think in other countries as well. And it is to acknowledge the fact that we can no longer assume that our laws are going to protect people in the way they were written to protect. And instead of tying certain rights and responsibilities to work, I want to argue to employment, I would argue we have to think about core rights and protections that we provide to all workers, regardless of who they're working for. Rights and responsibilities ties to work, and think about what are those fundamental rights we want to protect. Sort of like the rights the ILO describes in its global protections, apply that in a national context. Secondly, I think there's then another set of rights that we have to have stronger presumptions of employment and more straightforward tests to assure workers get those rights. And we can talk about what those look like. In the United States, we have a number of states that have actually put forward legislation that does this, that makes it much more clear that you can't simply call someone an independent contractor and get out of rights and responsibilities. So I regard that as the second concentric circle of public policy. And then finally, I would argue we have to think about a third concentric circle about giving access to workers, regardless of whether they're classified as an employee or an independent contractor, access to benefits, social protections through different kinds of mechanisms. But let's take that need for greater flexibility and mobility of our workforce and separate it out from the need, the protections we have for workers about basic rights. Those are two different kinds of public policy issues, and I would argue we need to separate them out as separate things rather than trying to tie social benefits to worker rights. That's a dangerous road, something we've had a lot of problems with in the United States as we think about the fissured workplace.